Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Brooke Edmonds. I'm with OSU Extension in Oregon. And today we are really delighted to have Erin Posthumus from the U.S. National Phenology Network joining us for our monthly webinar. So these webinars are put together for our state master gardeners, but we do open them up to the public and encourage you, if you're not already a master gardener, to become one. Check into your local state. So today, Erin is going to be sharing on citizen science, master gardeners, and nature's notebook. Erin has a master's degree in wildlife conservation and management from the University of Arizona and has been with the U.S. National Phenology Network since 2010. One of her major responsibilities is serving as the outreach coordinator for the Nature's Notebook Plant and Animal Observation Program. And thank you so much and welcome, Erin.
Well, thanks so much for having me today. I'm really glad to be able to talk to so many different people from across the country, as well as to our Oregon Master Gardeners and the people that are part of the Oregon Season Trackers program. So what I'll be talking about today is just generally about phenology and what phenology is and why it's important. I'll talk about what the USA National Phenology Network is and how we collect data through Nature's Notebook, our plant and animal observation program, and then share some of the results specifically that have been collected by observers in Oregon and tell you about the ways that we're using that data. So first off, just to make sure we're all on the same page about phenology, phenology comes from the Greek word pheno, which means to show, to bring to light, or to make appear. And you can think of this like the difference between phenotype and genotype. So phenotype is the appearance of the genotype. So our definition that we use here for phenology is it's the study of recurring plant and animal life cycle stages and their timing, and specifically their relationship with climate and other abiotic variables. So these are things like temperature or precipitation. So phenology is not a new concept. Many people, indigenous peoples and Native Americans, have been using phenology as a way to track when things happen across the year. So there are lots of different moons that you might have heard of that are tied to these different events of plants and animals. So February is known as the worm moon, May is known as the flower moon, September the harvest moon, and November the beaver moon. And knowing when these things happen in nature can actually be used to take certain actions as well, specifically in knowing when to plant certain things or take certain actions to harvest crops. So for example, you can harvest corn when oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear. Once lilac flowers have faded, plant squash and cucumbers. When crabapple and wild plum are at bud break, eastern tent caterpillars are hatching. So if you know of any of these other examples, then you can share those with me. I'm always looking to collect more of these. I find them really fun. So Aldo Leopold, one of our great ecologists, is actually also a phenologist. So he had a great quote that I like to share about phenology, that phenology, in short, is a horizontal science, which transects all ordinary biological professions. Whoever sees the land as a whole is likely to have an interest in it. And I really like this because it describes how phenology really transects lots of different aspects of environmental work. So phenology is important for many different reasons. It has lots of different applications. So in terms of human health, we can think of phenology being important for allergy season. It also has ties to disease vectors like mosquitoes and ticks. So knowing when those things are active can help to predict when you might have a problem with the disease and when you should manage for those species. Resource management, it might have to do with things like knowing when hunting season should happen or when to put limits on fishing because of different breeding seasons for animals. In conservation, it might be things like managing for invasive species or knowing when to go out to harvest seeds of native grasses or other native plants that you might want to harvest and propagate. For agriculture, just knowing when to plant or harvest certain crops. Understanding hazards, phenology has lots of linkages to wildfire, such as when you have a longer growing season, you might have a greater risk of fuel for fires. And then recreation has ties to phenology as well. You could think about colored leaves with people going leaf peeping in the fall in the Northeast. That has lots of ties to recreation and tourism. Also things like cherry bloom festivals and other flower festivals. So another application is with gardening. Obviously, urban growers can really care about phenology because that's when either the flowers are blooming or fruits are available for harvest. We were involved in a recent paper that I've put there at the bottom there, just came out in the journal Insects this year, that was really looking at how you can use phenology to manage insects, mostly problematic insects, but you can also think about it as pollinators as well. But we've tried to think about how phenology can be used to really reduce the use of pesticides. If you are able to plant at certain times or to try to avoid the incidence of insects, you can really reduce that the amount of insecticides that you have to use in your gardens. So that's a kind of a new area we've been exploring into as well. Phenology can also be used to look at changes in climate. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back in 2007 stated that phenology is perhaps the simplest process in which to track changes in the ecology of species in response to climate change. So they recognize that phenology is something that's really easy to observe, and it's something that a lot of different people can do in their own backyards. So it's really a great way to see those changes reflected in the plants and animals. So often when we think about phenology and changes in phenology, we think about the drivers of phenology. And what I mean by that is, what are the climate variables or other abiotic variables that influence something to happen in a plant or an animal? So in a plant, you might think of temperature or precipitation being very closely related to when a plant leaves out or when a plant flowers, when a plant changes color in the fall. For animals, it might be not so much related to the climate, but related to the day length. So a lot of migratory birds rely on the angle of the sun or the length of the day. We also call that photoperiod to know when to migrate. And so in addition to knowing about when something starts and when it ends, we're also interested in the peak that happens. So in this graph, you can see it's the number of open flowers on plants throughout the growing season. And so we have what we would call the onset of that life cycle event happening and the end of that happening, but also the peak in when the most flowers in this case are available on plants. And that has a lot of implications for pollinators and animals so that they can be really linked up with when those peaks are happening. Invasive species also can alter phenology in a lot of different ways. So there's a phenomenon known as extended leaf phenology. And so if you think about a deciduous forest where most of the overstory trees lose their leaves in the winter, it's really important in the springtime before those overstory trees have their leaves for all of the understory plants and even animals to really access that sunlight. And we've been finding that invasive shrubs actually are really good at taking advantage of that sunlight that reaches the understory in the spring. And they're able to kind of crowd out the native species, which are somewhat slower to respond to changes. So in years, especially where you have earlier temperatures that are warming up, those invasive shrubs are really able to take advantage of that and leaf out very quickly, whereas native shrubs are not. So they really can change ecosystems in a lot of different ways. Phenology shifts can happen in a lot of different ways. So if you think about that first and last event in a particular life cycle event with the peak, it can shift uniformly. So that would mean that everything shifts. So the onset and the peak and the end all shift in the same degree. But shifts can happen in other ways too. Sometimes the first event will shift. So you might have the onset of leafing or flowering happening several weeks earlier, but the end date still remains the same. You might also have both of them extending. So we've actually seen that in some species where the growing season is getting longer for certain species. So they have their leaves out for a long period of time. That might sound like it's advantageous for the plants, but sometimes they actually are taxed by having the leaves out for too long. There can be issues with drought, and so it's not always a good thing for plants to have a really long growing season. We can also see shifts where the onset doesn't change, but the end date does change. So you can get a similar, lengthening of the growing season, but also a shortening of the season as well. So there have been lots of different shifts that have been documented, and there's an article that provides a really good summary of some of these changes. And that article actually came out in 2003. So even back then, that was a long time ago now, there are already many changes being documented. But it provides a nice summary of a lot of different taxa and how things are changing. But generally, range limits, which is the area that a species is able to occupy based on the environment that it can use, those have actually shifted 6.1 kilometers per decade northward. So a lot of things are shifting to places that are cooler than they used to be, because they can't survive at the current places they are living now because those places have gotten too warm. They can similarly shift up in elevation. So if you think about things moving up mountains because it's cooler there and it's matching the place that they used to be in. We're also seeing earlier spring timing shifting 2.3 days per decade. And a majority of species that they studied also showed shifts in spring advancement. So that would be those onset dates of plants and animals shifting to earlier in the year. So I have lots of different examples here of other examples of shifts that have been found. There are just many, many research articles that have looked at this, but we're seeing earlier leaf out in trees, earlier flowering, earlier arrival of migratory birds and butterflies in some cases, earlier breeding and egg laying in some birds and amphibians, and then earlier animal emergence from hibernation and things like marmots. This is just some examples specifically for the Northwest. So people have found sockeye salmon are migrating earlier because of changes in stream temperatures. Lilac and honeysuckle flowers are blooming earlier. The temperature seems to influence the breeding behavior in northern flickers, and so they're actually breeding earlier. Temperature and snow accumulation also can impact breeding in toads as well. Some studies have actually looked at really long-term data sets to find these phenology shifts. So Thoreau actually kept pretty detailed phenology records at Walden Pond. And so there have been researchers that have compared what's happening today with flowering plants to the flowering plants that Thoreau documented back in the mid-1800s, and actually seen quite a big shift in the flowering timing to today. And some of that may have to do with the urban heat island effect because of all the changes that have happened in that area. But it's just really critical that we had those records so we can look at the change over time. And similarly, there's a study that compared the records collected by Aldo Leopold and his daughter Nina Leopold Bradley, and looking at the changes in the timing of arrival of sandhill crane and geese back in Aldo Leopold's time to today, and seeing a shift of 2 to 3 weeks on average there. So what are the consequences of these kinds of shifts? And so one really well-studied example is of the pied flycatcher. It's a bird that migrates from North Africa to Europe. And this bird actually relies on day length, or the angle of the sun, to know when to migrate. So typically it's arriving the same time every year. And it's evolved over time to have its migration so that when the nestlings of that bird are ready to feed, there are lots of caterpillars available. So the parents are able to go out and collect food and bring it back to the nest. But these researchers have documented that because of climate changes, the timing of the leaf out in the trees and the abundance of this food source is actually shifting to several weeks earlier. So the peak in when caterpillars are available for the parents to feed their nestlings is actually much earlier when the birds are still in eggs. So that really creates a lot of issues, and they've actually seen long-term population declines in that species. We've also seen more recently, researchers have documented changes here in North America. So this was a study that looked at how birds are able to keep up with shifts in spring. And again, that would be related to the leaf out in the trees, and then the insects that are feeding on those leaves on which these migrating birds depend. And they found that for at least 9 songbirds, they seemed to be unable to keep up with those shifts that they were seeing in the earlier leaf out. Another example of mismatch, this was an article that just came out earlier this year. This is going back to that idea of when the overstory trees in a forest are without leaves, then it's really an important time for the understory plants to access sunlight. And so they looked at how does the timing change in the overstory trees related to early season wildflowers. And they found that these deciduous trees are actually starting to leaf out earlier, so they're creating more shade when the wildflowers really need it. And they've actually seen a lot of reductions in the wildflowers because they're not able to access that sunlight at the important time. And so it's really negatively affecting the populations of those species of wildflowers. So moving on to the NPN and what we do. So we are primarily a USGS funded organization. We're actually housed at the University of Arizona here in Tucson. And we were started back in 2007. And the idea was there wasn't really a standardized way to collect phenology information and make that data available for researchers. So we were started by a couple co-founders. One was a USGS ecologist here in Arizona, Julio Betancourt, and another was Mark Schwartz, who is in Wisconsin. And they decided that we needed a national network that would be able to bring together all of this phenology information and really be the primary data source of phenology for the country. So we have 3 main areas that we focus on here. One of our primary directives is to inform decisions. So because we're a USGS funded initiative, we work a lot with other agencies in the Department of the Interior. So that would be things like the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And our aim is to provide them with phenology data and information that they need to make decisions. So they might have questions about how climate change is impacting the timing of plants or animal activity in their parks. Or they might want to know when are certain animal species active so we can avoid bothering them with different restoration activities on a wildlife refuge. It might have to do with invasive species, when to manage those species. So we work with these partners in a lot of different ways, and we help them collect the data that they need. So we have our data collection program that they can access, but we also can provide them data that have been collected through our many, many citizen scientists across the country. And we also work with them to create different products, and I'll be sharing a few of those later as well. Another pillar that we have is advancing science. So we make all of the data that are collected by our citizen scientists available through our database, and we actually summarize those data in many different ways to make it easier for researchers to access and use them. So these are just a handful of different publications that have been produced in the scientific literature that use the data collected through Nature's Notebook. Our data and data products have also been used in several different reports. So the U.S. National Climate Assessment uses one of our indicators of spring, and also the EPA Climate Change Indicators uses our products as well. And then the third pillar that we have is communicating and connecting about phenology. So we're involved in several different communities of practice. We have one that is for our local phenology leaders here through the NPN. So we connect with them to make sure that they have the resources that they need. We also communicate with researchers in the field of phenology to make sure that everyone knows about the current research that's coming out. We do publication summaries to make those scientific publications more accessible to the public. But we also make sure that researchers are aware of new grant opportunities, employment opportunities, and other things just related to phenology. So the way that we get the data that are in our database is through our program, Nature's Notebook. So this is a multi-taxa national scale plant and animal observation program. It was started back in 2009. So the way that we observe phenology is it's a bit different between animals and plants. So for animals, it's kind of a checklist of species that our observers will document. And so for each species on their list that they observe, they record information about the activity, information about reproduction, like whether they see nest building or nestlings, and then information about development too. What's the success of the nest event? For plants, we actually have our observers tag individual plants and observe the same plants over time. And this is a really powerful way to get information about how things are changing from year to year. So if you use the same plant, then you know that the genes are the same, and you can see how that plant will react to different environmental conditions from year to year. So we really value our observers that document individual plants over the long term. By now we have lots of different sites that have been collecting for 5 or more years, and it's really exciting to be able to look at those data and see the changes over time. So for plants, we're recording things like the leaves and the flowers and the fruits. So the way that we collect phenology data is fairly complex. So you can think about, with phenology, you could just record the event that's happening. So that would be the onset of a particular event. So something like a leafing or flowering or fruiting. And that will give you information about when it first started happening each year. We actually do status monitoring, which involves our observers going out and recording on each day that they observe whether or not they saw the phenophase happening or the life cycle event happening. So this allows us to record not just the first event, but the end event as well. And for things, so species that have multiple different flowering events in a year, that actually allows us to record both of those different events. So instead of just getting the first date that it happened in the year, you can get the different periods over time. And we actually take it one step further, and we record the abundance in addition to the status information. So that would be the intensity or the number that you see. And so for things like leafing, it might be how full is the canopy, how many flowers do you have, how many ripe fruits, and for animals, you might record just how many do you see in a particular activity. So this allows us to record that peak in information, which is really important for things like mismatches with pollinators or other animals. And it also allows us to record multiple peaks over time. So we currently have standardized protocols for almost 1,000 plants and 369 animal species. So we always are getting requests to add new species, but we do have a lot of different, we started out with primarily indicators, things that were really good indicators of climate change, and then plants and animals that are very important economically. And we've gradually added on to that over time. So we have quite a good list of different species available for people to monitor. We also regularly, when we have new partnerships, we'll add on species that are of interest to those partners as well. We have 2 different ways that people can record data. So we have the ability for people to print out paper data sheets that they then enter on our website. But we also have a mobile app that allows people to enter data in the field, and it goes automatically into the database. And that actually works offline. So if you're in an area without service, then you can still record your data. And that's available for iPhone and Android. We also have a wide variety of training resources. So we have an online observer course that you can take. It takes about 45 minutes. And that just walks you through the basics of how to set up an observation site and how to register plants and animals, and kind of the steps for observing, how to use the online tools to enter your observations and edit them if you need to. We also have this in a printed form, and we also have a botany primer that's available that describes just basic botany for Nature's Notebook. So looking at some of the data that have come in, we have many stations across the country. We have almost 17,000 people who have contributed to Nature's Notebook over the last 10 years. So you can see the kind of the distribution of the data that have come in. And you might notice patterns in where these are located. Primarily our data follows urban centers, where more people are located, we have more data coming in. And we also have more recently some data points that are located in places where there aren't a lot of people. You might notice in places like North Dakota and in the Southeast, and that is primarily due to a data set that we just imported just a couple weeks ago from the National Ecological Observatory Network. So this is a network of about 50 different stations across the country that are using our protocols to collect plant phenology data. So it's really exciting for us to have that in our database now. So we have over 20 million records so far that have been collected, and those are all freely available for download and exploration. So another aspect of what we work on here at the NPN is it's a bit separate from our Nature's Notebook data collection program, but it's what we call a data product. And so in this case, it's called a Pheno Forecast. And we produce 13 of these currently for insect pests and invasive plants. And so the idea behind a Pheno Forecast is you can use information that's known about when a certain life cycle event in a plant or an animal happens, and you can forecast that for a particular year using some sort of a current weather information. So in this case, we have emerald ash borer. This is a forest pest that affects much of the eastern United States. And we've created a forecast. It's actually based on thresholds that are published mostly in the cooperative extension literature. And so these are known thresholds of accumulated temperature. So we can actually take these thresholds and plug in current weather information because we know how much heat has accumulated so far this year, and actually tell people all across the range of the species when we expect to see a life cycle event of interest in these species. So in this case, it's adult emergence of emerald ash borer, because that's when people typically treat this species or manage for this species. So we actually, we have a notification service where people can sign up for getting information and email for their zip code, and they can sign up for any of our 13 species that's of interest. And they will actually get a notification 2 weeks and then again 6 days before this life cycle stage occurs. And that will hopefully give them a heads up about when to go out and start managing for that species. So we're interested in figuring out how good are these predictions. A lot of the thresholds were developed by people that were located just in a single location. So because we are kind of broadening them out to the entire range of the species, we want to know how well they're performing. So we have what we call a Nature's Notebook campaign, which is a focused data collection effort called Pest Patrol. And we're asking people who live in the locations where these species are occurring to sign up for our notifications. And then when they get the notification, go out and see if that life cycle event is occurring. So this is a really exciting kind of new direction for us. And we're hoping to produce more of these kinds of forecasts, not just for invasive species, but also for native species as well. So I just wanted to give you kind of a glimpse of some of the results where we've had researchers use the Nature's Notebook data to discover certain things about how phenology is changing. So we've had a couple studies over the last few years that have looked at the onset of spring, and the idea behind this is it's based on when the early season plants are leafing out and flowering. And because we have models that we've developed in collaboration with researchers that predict these events, we can actually look at how the onset of spring has changed over the last 100 years. And so we did this in the context of national parks and national wildlife refuges to take a look at how spring is changing right now in the parks and refuges. And we found that in 75% of the parks and refuges, spring is advancing, and in 50% is actually advancing, so that the recent years of spring onset are actually much, much earlier than 95% of historical springs in the last 100 years. Phenology data from Nature's Notebook have also used to help manage invasive species. So here in the Southwest, we have a problematic plant called bufflegrass. So we've actually used Nature's Notebook observations of when bufflegrass gets green to tell people when to manage it and when to spray herbicides on that plant. And be able to be more effective in their timing so that they can avoid spraying when native plants are active and actually hit the invasives when they're most susceptible. We've also had researchers look at how winter temperatures are changing and impacting spring leaf out. And they found that with warmer winters, you generally have earlier spring leaf out in plants, which makes sense. Researchers have also documented just earlier springs in general in different species, and then also an increase in growing season length. So we have all of these, they're summarized on our website, and I put the URL there if you want to look at some of the other findings that we've had. So specifically from Oregon data, I wanted to share, this was a more recent article just from a couple years ago that looked at deciduous broadleaf plants all across the country, and it included data from Oregon. And it found that it actually looked at Nature's Notebook data in addition to herbarium data, which you might know of herbarium, but they have plant collections, and a lot of times they have documented plants from 100 or more years. So it's actually a really great data source to look at when you have flowering plants at different times of the year over the last century. So they combined the herbarium data with the Nature's Notebook observations and found that the flowering is shifting earlier. And so on the graph, you see the day of first flowering, and that's been changing. If you look at comparing 2003 up to 2015, you see a shift of quite a few weeks there to earlier flowering timing. So now I wanted to talk about some specific results from one of our, what we call our local phenology programs in Oregon, and that is Oregon Season Tracker. So I know we have some Oregon Season Tracker observers with us today, so I'm going to say a big thank you to all of you. So Oregon Season Tracker was started back in 2014, and it's a collaboration between Oregon State Extension and the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, which is managed by the Forest Service and is also a LTER, Long-Term Ecological Research Station. And I know we have Jody Einerson here on the webinar, so she is the local phenology leader for that program. And it's just a very powerful program. We have a number of these, I think probably 300 at this point, of local phenology programs across the country. And sometimes these are very small efforts like a single nature center or a university. In this case, Jody has expanded it so we actually have anyone from Oregon can join up and observe, and they have a list of priority species that they're interested in, and they're collecting data that will be of use to their partners at the experimental forest. And they have such a great program that's just been so powerful and effective over time that we actually awarded them the Pheno Champion Award last year, which is our, it's an award we started several years ago that just shows that we have really great programs out there, and really helps share examples of programs so that we can give these examples out to other local phenology programs to show them how these effective programs are managed and all the different activities that they do to keep their volunteers engaged and collect really high quality data. So just taking a look at some of the results from Oregon Season Tracker. So they've actually monitored 126 species. Some of these are the priority species, and then they also have just a wide range of species that people have also collected data on. They have almost 72,000 records they've collected. And I think that there must have been a couple early years before they really got kicked off in 2014, but the records actually go back to 2011 in our database. Some of the top species that they've observed is vine maple is the first one. I know that they've been doing a recent push to get more people to observe that species. It's one that's really of interest to their experimental forest partners, but also a number of other tree species and some shrubs as well. And they've had 84 different observers who have contributed data. So I wanted to share some of the results from Oregon Season Tracker, but I want to put them in the context of some of what we call our campaigns. So these are data collection efforts that are focused on specific species. The first one we call the green wave. So this has to do with the green up of these deciduous trees across the country. So this includes maples, oaks, and poplars. And these trees are really responsible for a lot of the carbon cycling that happens from North America. So a lot of these are the overstory dominant trees in forest ecosystems. And this satellite image from NASA actually really shows the change in just what you can see from a satellite in how green these trees get by leafing out over time. So it really has a lot of implications on carbon cycling, so the uptake of carbon by trees that can change the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which has a lot of linkages to things like drought and water cycling as well. So researchers have used these data already, and this is one of our longest running campaigns. So it goes back to the early days, back in about 2012 is when we launched it. But they've actually used the data to validate models that show how climate will impact phenology in trees and shifting to earlier leaf out, and also to learn that deciduous trees can leaf out weeks earlier. So a couple of different researchers have published those studies. Looking specifically at vine maple, so this is an example of a phenology calendar. So this shows the different life cycle events that we asked the questions about on the data sheet and their reports from this year. So we can see for things like breaking leaf buds that started occurring in March, and then we had leaves, and then colored leaves happening later in the summer. And then also we have reports of flowering. So we have flowers or flower buds, and then open flowers, pollen release, and then fruiting phenophases as well that were collected. So I'll say one more thing about this. So this calendar shows when an observer reported a yes answer to one of these questions. So it gives a good indication of when these things were happening, but not necessarily the peak in when that's happening. So we also have activity curves which can show this. So this is a graph that shows of all of the trees that were observed, how many of the vine maples had a reported yes for that particular question. So this is about breaking leaf buds. And this compares 2019 to 2018 here, so 2019 in blue. And I think what's really interesting is when you start to compare, well, what was the preceding winter like that might have impacted, any differences that you might see. So I like to look at the NOAA mean temperature percentiles. So the first map at the top is for 2019 and shows that for Oregon, it was pretty much an average winter. So this is January to March, the mean temperatures. A couple of places were a little colder than normal. And then 2018, last year, was also fairly normal, a little bit warmer than average. So we don't really see a huge difference between these 2 years in terms of vine maple breaking leaf buds. Although we do have that the blip in a few trees had reported breaking leaf buds really early in the year. And then we see a slightly earlier onset in that main peak there that shows that maybe it did occur a little bit earlier in 2018 when it was a little bit warmer there. If we look at leaves, we can see that really leaves happened at about the same time in 2019 and 2018, so we don't see a large difference there. If we look at a different year, so I wanted to find a year where it was actually much warmer than average in Oregon. So 2016, actually the winter from January to March was, it had quite a few locations that were much above average. So in that, you actually can see that signal kind of being represented in the data there in breaking leaf buds, where 2016 was several weeks earlier than 2019 in terms of the peak and when those leaves started to come out. In leaves, we also see a similar signal of that phenophase happening a little bit earlier in 2016 than 2019. So for the Green Wave campaign this year, we've actually been asking people to focus on flowering because we're really interested in pollen. It's one of the kind of applications for human health and knowing about allergy season. So we've been asking our observers to kind of have a special focus on when the open flowers are available and when pollen is released. So these are just some really preliminary results of what they're finding in Oregon. So this is, again, Oregon season tracker data. So I just picked out the 3 species where we had the most records. So we have not too many species, but for big leaf maple, we had, this represents 6 plants, and the average date of first open flowers was June 6th. In Oregon white oak, it was the 12th, and then vine maple was actually April 24th. And you can see with the species where we have more individual plants, we have much less variability in that data. So it's definitely better to have more and more species or more and more plants. So I encourage people that aren't observing yet to join us and help us kind of improve those numbers and get a better sense of when the open flowers are occurring. And then with pollen release, that's generally happening about the same time as the flowering, a little bit later for vine maple. And this is just a map that shows kind of that timing and how it's different over Oregon. So generally, for different stations that are collecting data on these 3 species, we're seeing pollen release and in about May to June for most of those locations. We're also asking people to focus on leaf color. We're actually going to be producing a map this next year of when we expect to see leaf color in different places across the country. So the data from this year will help with that. So generally, big leaf maple, the onset of colored leaves was June 11th. Oregon white oak, September 15th, and then vine maple, August 23rd. And that was from this year. And then looking at that in a phenology calendar format, you can see that most of the colored leaves for vine maple and Oregon white leaf or white oak were reported in the summer and fall. I'm not sure what's going on with the big leaf maple. I think sometimes people interpret colored leaves as just any time when there's color on the leaves. And for some species of maples in particular, sometimes when the leaf buds first appear, they can kind of look reddish. I know that's the case for red maple. So it could be that people are interpreting that as there are red leaves, especially those dates in May when you're probably having the leaves come out. But the leaf color could be lasting too through the winter time, and maybe that's what's responsible for the January to March timing there. And then one other campaign I just wanted to mention is our Nectar Connectors campaign. So this is a campaign that supports conservation of monarch butterflies. So we're interested in reporting information about nectar availability from monarchs. And so for Oregon, we're interested in whether there is nectar available in the summertime when monarchs are there before they return to their wintering grounds in California. So we have just a few stations that are reporting on showy milkweed. And so they reported the leaves and the flowers. So the leaves are important for the caterpillars of monarchs, and then the flowers are important as nectar. And so we do have some reports showing that nectar was available for those monarchs and other pollinators in the early summer. And then this activity curve shows that we had the leaves appearing, kind of peaking in early May, and then the open flowers in early June. So we're collecting more data this year for Nectar Connectors, and these are some of the results from last year, but we're really interested in seeing whether the timing of open flowers matches up to when monarchs really need them. So we're gonna have to have many more years of data collection to really see that. So we don't have that many people in Oregon, as you can see from the map, and you can see for people that are in other parts of the country, kind of the gaps that we have. So we're always looking for more people for this campaign as well. So ways that you can join us. We're really interested in having more observers collect data as part of Nature's Notebook. And you're welcome to reach out to me if you want more help getting started with that. If you're interested in starting even a local phenology program in your area, I can tell you more about that. That would be when you're observing with multiple people as part of an organization or a local effort. And then I also invite you to look at the data that we have available. We have a really neat visualization tool where you can explore the data, and you can always sign up for our Pheno Forecasts too to get notifications about that. So thank you so much for your attention, and I will take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. We really appreciate it. And I always say this, you can't hear everybody clapping, but they're all clapping. So while folks are thinking about what Erin has shared, if you have questions for her, if you could please put them in the Q&A box. And if we're not have time to get to them, then we'll have a link to your email and we can follow up. I was putting links that Erin had mentioned. I put them in the chat box, but I'll also be sending them out a little bit later on. And there will be an evaluation survey coming out. And Erin, I'm just going to say this now. There was a little recording issue, so I'm going to catch up with you to re-record like your first 3 slides. Okay. And then we'll get that out to everybody. And then we are planning for next year's webinar series, and that'll be announced after the first of the year. And for our Oregon Master Gardeners, just a really quick save the date. OMGA and OSU are bringing back the Master Gardener Mini College to the OSU campus in Corvallis. So if you could save the dates of July 24th and 25th, and then many more details will be coming out later on. So let's take a look at some of these questions. I thought one thing that was really interesting that might be a good connection on the monarchs is that I know that a lot of our Master Gardener in their demonstration gardens, a lot of them have been trying patches of milkweed. And so that might be a really good connection to connect with those groups to see if they'd be willing to do some monitoring, because I know like in my region, just sort of like up and down the Willamette Valley, there might be quite a few opportunities to add some patches, and I know different schools and things. So
yeah, that would be great. Yeah, and so you can actually, we have a number of different milkweeds on our list, and then we also have monarchs, so you could actually record both of those at the same site. Yeah. And
so that's the monarchwatch.org?
No, so Monarch Watch, that's where the map came from. So they do record monarchs, and I think they're responsible for the tagging program as well, or they're affiliated with that. So it's a little bit separate. So this would just be observations of adult butterflies as well as caterpillars. And you could actually say that you saw them on your milkweed plants.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, we'll get all that information and we can get it sent out to folks. So let's see. So Mary Jo has a question, but going back to the graphic that you showed on the Green Wave campaign, and that she noticed that there was some red colors appearing and disappearing on the map. Could you just explain what we were looking at there?
That might have been on the NOAA satellite map. I'm assuming.
Yeah, there's just like this flux of colors, and so I know we were focusing on the green as the trees.
It doesn't actually. I wish that that satellite image had the month, or some sort of a date on it. But I think that is probably leaf color, especially if it's on the northeast, because that can be seen on satellites as well.
Gotcha. So Sherry and a couple other folks have questions about a lot of the observations seem to be coming from more natural areas, and is there interest in collecting data from a home garden setting or even like an urban garden setting?
Yeah, we have a lot of data that come in from urban areas, and those are really valuable as well. And the way that we kind of account for the differences that might happen in urban versus more natural areas is we have what we call metadata. So when you sign up your site and register your plants, you put in a number of different pieces of information about how urban is it? Do you have like a road nearby? Is there a water source? If you're collecting animal data, we want to know if you have a feeder. So there are a lot of different ways that you can record that information that might impact the phenology of your plants and animals in particular.
Great. So back to your Pheno Forecasts. I was looking at the list of available maps. There's definitely a couple of those species that will affect our master gardeners here in Oregon, like bronze birch borer and apple maggot. Anthony has a question about how do you set like priorities for which species? So he's thinking about spotted lanternfly issue. So how do you determine which maps that you make?
So, so far we've kind of been going after what we would call low-hanging fruit. So it's maps that already have a published threshold. So people have already done the research, mostly in cooperative extension, and they know that there's a certain amount of accumulated heat or amount of precipitation that influences that life cycle event to happen. So for spotted lanternfly, there isn't one yet. And I know researchers are working on that. There's actually been extensive research in South Korea, because that's where that species comes from. But we don't have one for here yet. So we're interested in developing other models. So that would require actually working with researchers to make the models. So it's a little bit harder for us to do that, but we are interested in that as well.
Yeah, it's hard when something's just shown up.
Yeah.
So you don't have any data,
Right.
because nobody knows about it.
Yep.
Let's see. So a couple folks have asked about the presentation being available. We'll get a recording out. If Erin's willing to share slides, we'll include those as well. Mm-hmm. So Judith has a question. So I think this is going back to the Nature's Notebook, where you're picking from a list of species that you're monitoring. She wants to know, like, do you select by maturity of the tree? How do you account for the age of the plants if you're monitoring?
Yeah, so we generally recommend people pick adult, larger trees and shrubs in their yard, and not, things that they've just planted. But if that's all that you have, then we do have a place for you to report that in the registration of the plant as well. There's a comment field, and we encourage people to say that. And you can put the planting date, and then also say, this is a younger tree, and that will explain why maybe it hasn't had fruit on it in a particular year.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Couple of more little tips on your first slide, where you had the anecdotal little stories. So we'll make sure to share those with you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Scott has a comment on the data collection for the big leaf maples, where you had that early season question on the leaf color. And so he's wondering if maybe it has something to do with the health of the trees. So maybe the trees are aging, or, showing a stress. And so that might be something to,
Yeah, sometimes we do get people, there's insect stress or drought stress that can or it can create colored leaves at a weird time of year. So generally we recommend only reporting on colored leaves when it's because of late season fall color. But you can say that there's some damage, or maybe you suspect that there's drought or insect stress, and then put that in the comments for that date too.
Gotcha. So then you, on the back end, you have a whole team of people that sort of comb through and sort through the data?
No, actually. So we actually make all of our data available pretty much as is. We do have a number of what we call our quality control flags, and that would be like if you have two observers at the same group that go out on the same day and they say different things, we'll flag that. But we don't want to kind of make assumptions about data being bad or good quality. So we really leave it up to the researchers or the data end users to do that quality checking and try to identify what is really an outlier in the data set. Gotcha. So because we have so many different species, it would just be hard for us to try to make a determination about that.
Right. So then if a researcher was going to come and use that data set, that might be a point where they take a little closer look before they start drawing conclusions.
Say, I want to see all the comments too for the observation, so that they can kind of figure out what's going on.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Anne had a question on that collection of data. Are you only interested in those species where you have like you said you had like full protocols on some of them?
Yeah, so right now you can only record in Nature's Notebook on the species we have on our list. We do have a process to request species. We try not to do too many, because we don't want to end up with thousands and thousands of species with only a little bit of data. We want to have a focused data set that has a lot of data on the species that we have. But we do make exceptions for especially partner groups where we know there's going to be a lot of data coming in. So we can definitely talk about that if someone has a particular species question.
Great. So I'm looking at just the questions that are left. I think we can answer most of these offline. I know that folks are, concerned about climate change and sort of like the funding and how that all works. And so it's really great that your group exists, right? And that it's funded and it's able to show these trends. I mean, I think that's what people need to see, are these maps. Yeah. So it's great to have those as a resource, because I think even as gardeners, that's something that we can take a look at, because we see the same trends. We might be growing totally different plants, but we're going to see those same trends of, oh, it's an earlier spring, or I've noticed, that it's
Yeah.
been getting earlier and
That's
earlier.
why it's so
So,
important to document that, because yeah, you can have a sense of, yeah, I think this is earlier than last year or earlier than it usually happens, but being able to actually look in the database and see, oh yeah, it was actually 2 weeks earlier is really powerful.
yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks, Erin. We really appreciate your spending the time to share about Nature's Notebook and how just regular citizens can contribute to this amazing data set. So thank you
Thanks
very
so much for
much.
having me.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.